Hi, this video is going to be partly an announcement. This month of October, I'm going to be bringing out scary related material. All sorts of macabre and occult things that you could use in your tabletop role-playing games. I'm going to focus on that. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask that if you have any suggestion or recommendation of a subject that I could talk about, please let me know in the comments section below. I have some ideas on the different videos that I'm going to be producing, but it would also help if you have some suggestions as to what types of things I can talk about in these videos. And today I'm going to start with how to use graveyards and cemeteries in your tabletop role-playing games. This is going to be more helpful for game masters and dungeon masters, etc. of course, but player characters could benefit from the information here, because maybe your game master is using some of these elements in a way or the other in any horror adventure, and maybe you can find the solutions to the puzzles, the weak points of some adversaries as you are playing those adventures. You never know. Sometimes as game masters we share some ideas, so maybe something that I talk about here will serve as a sort of a tool or a tip to overcome your challenges with your own dungeon master, game master, referee. So when it comes to graveyards and cemeteries, I think they are some of the best adventure sites that you can use in horror role-playing games. This is quite obvious, but they represent so many things. They are not just there to serve as a place for the final rest of those that have departed, that suffered a natural or unnatural deaths. They are also places that contain many secrets. All of those lives buried there, with so many adventures and misadventures, all sorts of encounters and objects buried with them. Their stories were literally taken to the grave with them. They have been preserved in books or through their loved ones, through many ways. But when it comes to cemeteries and graveyards in role-playing games, it's like going into a field of scary Jack-in-the-Box type of encounters. You never know what's going to pop out from the tomb, from the grave, from the mausoleum, from the crypt. It could be an enemy. It could even be a friendly or non-hostile entity. Or maybe you can find some treasures. It depends on the type of character and adventure that you are running. I want to approach this subject as if we are entering a graveyard. Let's start with the exterior. A great source of inspiration. It could be the best campaign settings that exist. For example, in Forgotten Realms, in the City of Splendors, Waterdeep, the graveyard is quite big. During the day, it is used as a place to have some picnics, just to stroll around, walking in tranquility with your friends and family. But during nighttime, the undead rise. And so the city guard are surrounding the cemetery, not to keep grave robbers out specifically, but to protect the citizens from the undead monstrosities that try to escape the graveyard. So that's a very interesting concept. You could run perhaps a few short adventures with the characters as guards trying to fight the undead that try to walk into the city or shamble into the city. And there is this movie, I think it was called Cemetery Man, and although the story gets quite surreal and I think loses a bit of the way when it comes to some consistency or continuity for the storyline, maybe some people like that the storyline starts as being something and turns into something else completely by the end. But the main character there he's basically a gravekeeper, and he's the guardian that fights the undead that rise during the night to keep the rest of the populace safe, that is the citizens. So you could have a short campaign like that. I think if that is the entirety of the campaign, it could be a bit boring by the end. or repetitive. Although there is a way to go around this. There is a way to have an entire campaign with the player characters as guardians of the cemetery, keeping those undead in check as jail keepers of sorts, or wardens. But we will get to that in a few minutes. Another interesting thing of cemeteries and graveyards, and maybe I forgot about to say this sometimes, like I told you, sometimes I mix folklore and occult lore with these adventure ideas. I think it adds to the coherency and the philosophical and even mythological richness of the ideas. In real life, maybe you haven't noticed this, but many cemeteries, graveyards, etc., many burial grounds have these metal fences. Even if they have these walls of stone, usually they have a lot of metal and spikes on the top area. And some could think, well, that's to keep grave robbers outside, or anyone who shouldn't be at the graveyard at night. But when it comes to the occult side of that, metal, specifically iron, has been used to thwart, to repel, and even dissipate or eliminate, in some cases, different sorts of otherworldly entities. There are some exceptions, and you could also use this in your role-playing games, like for example, the on the side of the Fey beings and the fairies and such, you have the red caps that are supposed to be immune to iron, but a lot of entities, all sorts of weird things like vampiric entities and larvae, like floating things that drain the energy of people and devour all sorts of spiritual substances, even demons. A lot of demons, actually, if you have taken a look at the occult lore of all of those Solomonic grimoires, you see that the practitioner is always armed with swords and knives and daggers, and it looks like he's going into battle, and that's because the metallic point, if it's the sharper and the pointier the better, can be used to strike down such entities. Although, according to that philosophy, you should be cautious because they actually produce this sort of shock when supposedly you puncture them with your metal point. So you should use, according to that, a glove of silk or linen, or I imagine rubber. So, taking that into consideration, you can understand why, according to that, different burial sites have these metal fences with spikes. They are there to keep any sort of entity from escaping the burial ground and attacking the living in all sorts of invisible and subtle ways. So you could also use that in your campaign. Maybe there is someone carrying out some sort of sabotage, maybe when nobody is noticing during the late hours of the during the night or the morning before the sun rises. Maybe somebody's actually bending those bars or removing those metal bars altogether so that the undead escape from the graveyard and attack the city. That could be a good plotline or even subplotline for an adventure. You have to carry out your investigations to catch who is carrying out that sabotage. Perhaps one of the citizens or a more powerful undead being or some sort of demon. And you could also modify this if, for example, if you are playing a high fantasy role-playing game, maybe they have to prepare these sort of wards or magical shields, protective sigils that will keep the undead inside the burial ground. And somebody is erasing these signs or pentacles or anything that you are handling in your role-playing games, and so the undead are escaping into the city and attacking people. So if we go beyond that, beyond the Lich Gate or the wall that surrounds the burial ground, and we go into the graveyard, we encounter all sorts of tombs. This makes us wonder about the true purpose of a graveyard or a cemetery. Many different people in the past used to burn their loved ones when they died. And for example, if you study ancient Egypt before the entire pharaonic era, we go to a more primitive time, you can see that at first Egyptians used to cut their loved ones, their corpses, the corpses of their loved ones. They cut them, the different limbs and their head, to keep them from rising. But of course, that sounds quite ridiculous. If you are playing a role-playing game, you can do that. You can add some undead that if they are not cut on their limbs, they are going to magically stitch together and walk and attack people. That's fiction. But if we were to look at things a bit more from a more philosophical or spiritual point of view, that disrupts the capacity of the corpse of housing some more powerful entities that can act freely, that could perhaps float outside of the corpse, drain the energy of the living, and go back into the corpse and use it as a sort of home or haven. That is related to all sorts of vampire legends, of course, but then you understand the reason as to why mummies were created according to that philosophy. And then when the pharaohs started to establish religion, because many of you know religion is used to control people in general, then they started to prohibit the cutting of bodies, and they started with the process of mummification and all of that, so that to better house those entities, those etheric revenants or vampires of sorts. I'm going to put a link in the description of this video to my playlist of other October videos, so you can check out my videos where I talk about vampire lore and such. It's related to that. So if we take into that into consideration and we apply it to graveyards and cemeteries, many you could think of the purpose of a specific burial ground. Maybe there are these priests that are actually using parts of the bodies, even either to raise undead or to use specific parts, like you would see in all of those obscure works, like using ribs and hands and heads of corpses to do dark sorcery. That explains a lot of things. If you want more ideas related to that, you could study about Catalina de Medici or the Borgia family. They did all sorts of nasty things related to sorcery and the occult. So you could get some ideas from that. The famous talking heads that they decapitate the head, especially of children, and they placed a sort of, they used those heads as a medium to talk with demons. They actually supposedly communicated through those decapitated heads, and that explains some crimes that sometimes happen, that they find corpses decapitated or with missing hands. It's not just about having a more an easier time to get away with that sort of crime, because many of you know you need hands and head to identify a corpse. So on the criminal side, you could think, oh, they do that so that they do not identify the corpse as easily, or perhaps never. But you could also, if you're using that in your tabletop role-playing game, you could say that they are using those parts to create all those macabre magical artifacts, like the Hand of Glory or the talking heads that I was talking about. That explains some of the... you could use those historical and even mythological moments where someone loses a head, their head or the hands. And for example, in the case of, there is this legend in Mexico that people in the US stole Pancho Villa's head for some reason. There's also that story about Geronimo's head being stolen in the US by a specific group. I'm sure you can imagine whom. You know, Skull and Bones. So there are a lot of legends related to that, to taking heads. So you could take those moments in history, or John the Baptist's head, and they actually, you could play it as related to those mysteries, like, oh, that head houses the power of a demon, or that hand is used to create this magical artifact. So maybe if you want to create an adventure about that obscure, macabre, terrifying subject, maybe that graveyard is actually used as a sort of supply depot or deposit, so that these evil priests take the bodies during the night and they use them in their foul rituals. So that could be a way of handling things. Another interesting thing related to graveyards could be could feature any sort of symbol or sign or glyph on the graves. Maybe there are some things written or painted or chiseled into the different graves that will make the dead rise during the night. Or maybe there is something that keep the dead trapped. Maybe you're actually carrying out a rescue mission. What if the loved one of one of the player characters, or they were hired by someone to rescue the spirit of a loved one because they put that person in a tomb or a grave with a particular symbol that keeps that spirit from ascending to some sort of paradise or the afterlife. You could also play it as a sort of rescue mission where the player characters need to infiltrate the graveyard and locate that tomb and remove that symbol or the entire headstone if needed, or the metal cross, so that the spirit rises to the other world or the afterlife or wherever that spirit needs to go. There's actually, I think, there was a Christian scholar, I don't remember who exactly it was, but that guy theorized that many, perhaps some spirits were trapped when they used metal crosses, because, like I told you, metal is supposedly like anathema to those entities, and when they used the metal cross, they trapped the spirit, and the spirit simply couldn't abandon the body. That is, if we are to think that the spirit was attached to the corpse after dying. And that's an interesting thing that you could also use it in tabletop role-playing games. Tombs, mausoleums, crypts, pretty much anything in the graveyard could be used to house other things besides enemies. For example, once again returning to Waterdeep, the City of Splendors, many of the tombs, the graves, the mausoleums, the crypts, they are gateways to pocket dimensions and to other dimensions as well, just as you would use any sort of entrance or pathway to reach another plane entirely. You could also use tombs, crypts, mausoleums for that purpose. Maybe there is a very powerful undead being like a vampire or a lich or a mummy, and they have their palaces of death and decay in the graveyard, but it's actually a pocket dimension. There is perhaps this huge mansion or an entire pyramid of sorts in a pocket dimension, or some sort of tower, a dungeon, and they are connected magically through all of those tombs and graves. That's another way to use graveyards. Now, when it comes to items of power, graveyards and cemeteries are also great. You can find perhaps weapons, armor, all sorts of magical jewelry that were buried with the people there. Maybe you will have to fight the former owners. Remember, like when Conan took his sword and the skeleton rose for a little time and for a little while and tried to attack Conan. Maybe it's a similar thing. Maybe you're looking for an item of great power, and the former owner rises and tries to fight you for it, perhaps to see if you are worthy of it. There is another case related to occult lore. It's related to a grimoire. I don't remember the exact grimoire. I don't know if it was the Galdar book or some other book. I think it was definitely another book. I don't remember the name. But supposedly it was buried with this sorcerer. So a guy dug out the corpse because he knew that the corpse of the sorcerer had the book with him, with the corpse. And he took the book from the corpse's hands and he became insane after that. So it was some sort of word that this sorcerer supposedly put on the book, and it was activated when they took the book from the book from the corpse's hands. So you could also play it like that. I think there is also the possibility of more mundane dangers in graveyards and cemeteries that you could use in your adventures. Because, for example, maybe grave robbers, they're always there. You could find them, and they do not want witnesses that they are robbing the graves. They could attack you. Or maybe you find these cults. These actually are a danger in real life. If you go to certain cemeteries and graveyards during the late hours, you could run into one of those groups that are trying to do some sort of necromancy. And if they don't want witnesses, they could actually attack you, perhaps even with guns. You never know, with knives. That is, we're talking about finding criminals in a graveyard or in a cemetery. So maybe you can play that out in your adventures. If you want inspiration, there are many urban explorer videos of those that go to the graveyards at night from different countries, and in some cases they have to run away because they find some unsavory individuals. So you could look for those videos. I'm sure you can find them quite easily. So you could have some more mundane encounters, like I mentioned. Maybe they are stealing parts of the bodies to do those foul rituals, or they're just, like I told you, just trying to steal some valuables from the dead. But if you need ideas in general for scary adventures related to graveyards, and for many other things as well, you can look to different religions. Like you could look at the many religions have all of those idols, those corpses and dead guys that they worship. So that's quite macabre. Those relics that are pieces of corpses. You could create adventures like, oh, they have that relic, the pinky finger of who knows what saint, and it's actually housing this curse or this demon or this evil vampiric entity that is attacking the townsfolk or the village, or they have this mummified saint of sorts, and it's actually an entity that is keeping a sort of mind control or hypnotic power over the entire village or city. Or you could handle it at different scales, and you can use it in any sort of role-playing game and setting. Even sci-fi games sometimes mix horror like that. Usually you could also perhaps relate it to some sort of alien entity if you want to have like a science fantasy sort of experience. Maybe it's an alien that has some sort of necromantic powers. You could also do it like that. But there are so many settings, those settings in the typical Roaring Twenties or in the Wild West, in the Victorian era. All of these ideas can be applied to any of those settings. So I hope all of these thoughts could give you some good concepts to come up with your own scenarios and perhaps entire campaigns. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I told you, I already have some ideas when it comes to the next subject or content that I'm going to be producing. But if you have suggestions, please let me know in the comment section. I am hungry for ideas on what I should talk about this month of October. And remember to check out the October playlist that contains other scary related topics. The early videos are lacking in sound quality, of course, but I still think it's worth watching those. Well, thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, like I told you, suggestions, recommendations, please let me know. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending DriveThruRPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you. I'm also going to bring out some scary related reviews. Thank you and see you later.